They called it the Jug because it looked like a milk jug with wings. German pilots took one look at this enormous American fighter and laughed. How could something that big and heavy possibly compete with their sleek, agile Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs? But Republic Aviation and the United States Army Air Forces knew something the Luftwaffe was about to learn the hard way. Sometimes, bigger really is better. This is the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the heavyweight champion of World War II that changed the rules of aerial combat forever. In 1940, America wasn't at war yet, but we were watching what was happening in the skies over Europe. Our military planners saw British Spitfires and German Bf-109 dogfighting at altitudes nobody had imagined just a few years earlier. They saw planes being shot down because they couldn't climb high enough, fast enough. Alexander Kartveli, the brilliant Georgian engineer at Republic Aviation, had a radical idea. Instead of trying to build the lightest, most nimble fighter, why not build the most powerful one? Why not create a fighter that could absorb punishment, dish it out in overwhelming quantities, and bring its pilot home safely? The concept was simple but revolutionary. Wrap the biggest, most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, in an airframe tough enough to handle it. This engine was a monster, producing 2,000 horsepower. That's more power than 5 Ford Model T automobiles combined. When the P-47 prototype first rolled out in May 1941, even American pilots had their doubts. The thing weighed 12,000 pounds empty. Compare that to the nimble P-51 Mustang at 7,000 pounds, or the German Bf-109 at just 5,500 pounds. Veteran pilots looked at this chunky fighter and shook their heads. In the air war over Europe, maneuverability was everything. How was this flying tank supposed to tangle with experienced Luftwaffe aces flying machines specifically designed for dogfighting? The early test reports didn't help. The P-47 was indeed heavy. It took a long time to climb to altitude. It wasn't going to outturn a Focke-Wulf 190 in a horizontal dogfight. On paper, it looked like the Thunderbolt might be a costly mistake. But the engineers at Republic knew what they were doing. They were playing a different game entirely. What those early critics didn't understand was that Alexander Kartveli and his team had thought several steps ahead. The P-47 wasn't designed to fight World War I-style turning battles. It was designed for the realities of high-altitude combat in 1943. First, that massive engine didn't just provide power, it provided something far more valuable: altitude performance. The P-47 could climb to 40,000 feet, higher than almost any other fighter of its time. At that altitude, the air is thin, engines gasp for oxygen, and most fighters become sluggish. But the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger kept that R2800 engine breathing easy, maintaining power where German fighters started to struggle. Second, all that weight brought structural strength. The P-47's airframe could handle dive speeds that would literally tear apart lighter fighters. In a dive, the Thunderbolt could hit 550 miles per hour. No Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf could follow without risking structural failure. Third, and most importantly, Republic built the P-47 like a flying tank. The cockpit had thick armor plating, the engine had a bulletproof cowling, the fuel tanks were self-sealing. You could put dozens of cannon shells into a Thunderbolt and it would keep flying. German pilots would soon learn this lesson over and over again. If you didn't kill the Jug on your first pass, you probably weren't getting a second chance. But the real surprise, the weapon that would make German pilots curse the day they ever encountered a P-47, was its armament package. 8 Browning M 2 50-caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. That's more concentrated firepower than any single-seat fighter in the world. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute. When a P-47 pilot pressed that trigger, he was sending a stream of half-inch diameter bullets downrange at a combined rate of over 100 rounds per second. Let me put that in perspective for you. The German Bf-109 typically carried 2 machine guns and 1 or 2 20mm cannons. The Focke-Wulf 190 might have 4 20mm cannons. Both were deadly weapons. But when a P-47 opened fire, it was like comparing a shotgun to a fire hose. Each 50-caliber round weighed about 2 ounces and traveled at nearly 3,000 feet per second. These weren't just bullets. They were armor-piercing incendiary rounds that could punch through engine blocks, sever control cables, rupture fuel tanks, and shred aluminum airframes. When 400 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition hit a German fighter in a 2-second burst, there often wasn't enough left to identify what aircraft it had been. American pilots who flew the P-47 in combat had a saying, "If you can see it, you can kill it." The effective range of those 850s was extraordinary. You could open fire from 1,000 yards out and still have a good chance of hitting your target. Most German cannon-armed fighters had to close to 400 yards or less to be effective. By early 1943, the first P-47 Thunderbolt units arrived in England. The 8th Air Force was taking terrible losses over Germany. Our B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were being slaughtered by German fighters because our escort fighters, P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs, didn't yet have the range to accompany the bombers deep into German territory. The 56th Fighter Group, the 78th Fighter Group, and the 4th Fighter Group were the first to receive P-47s. These units were filled with young American pilots, many of whom had never seen combat. They were flying a fighter that nobody, not the Germans, not even most Allied pilots, took seriously. The Luftwaffe pilots, many of them veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience, saw these big, chunky American fighters and assumed they'd be easy prey. German intelligence reports described the P-47 as heavy and unmaneuverable. Luftwaffe briefings suggested treating them like the lumbering Soviet fighters they'd been shooting down on the Eastern Front. That was their first mistake. April 15, 1943. That's the date when the Luftwaffe learned that the war had changed. The 4th Fighter Group, equipped with brand-new P-47s, was escorting B-17 bombers on a raid over France. Everything seemed routine until Focke-Wulf 190s of JG-26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, dove out of the sun to attack the bomber formation. The German pilots probably thought this would be like every other mission: slash through the American fighters, savage the bombers, and be back at base in time for lunch. These FW-190 pilots were experienced combat veterans. Many had been fighting since 1940. They'd shot down Spitfires, Hurricanes, and every other Allied fighter the RAF could throw at them. But on this day, they ran into something different. Captain Don Blakesley, leading the 4th Fighter Group, saw the German fighters coming and did something that surprised everyone, including his own pilots. Instead of turning to meet the threat, the standard defensive maneuver, he pushed his throttle forward and dove. Now, remember what we talked about earlier. The P-47 could dive faster than anything else in the sky. Blakesley and his wingmen plummeted down on those Focke-Wulfs like anvils falling from heaven. The German pilots, focused on the bombers, never saw them coming until it was too late. When the P-47s opened fire with those 850 caliber machine guns, the results were devastating. 3 FW-19s were blown apart in the first 5 seconds of combat. The remaining German pilots tried to turn and fight, but the P-47s had the speed advantage now. They could make one devastating pass, zoom back up to altitude using their tremendous power, and dive again. The Germans weren't laughing anymore. Those first few months of 1943 were a learning period for both sides. American pilots quickly figured out how to use the P-47's strengths while avoiding situations that exposed its weaknesses. The key was altitude and speed. American fighter leaders like Hub Zemke, Francis Gabreski, and Robert Johnson developed what became known as boom and zoom tactics. Start high, dive on your target at tremendous speed, fire your 850s. Use that speed to zoom back up to altitude before the enemy can react. Repeat. Never, ever get into a slow-speed turning fight with a German fighter. That was suicide. The Bf-109 and FW-190 could outturn a P-47 all day long, but they couldn't outdive it, they couldn't outclimb it at high altitude, and they certainly couldn't survive its firepower. German pilots who tried to follow a P-47 into a dive often discovered too late that their aircraft couldn't handle the speed. There are documented cases of German fighters literally breaking apart in mid-air, trying to chase diving Thunderbolts. Control surfaces would flutter and then tear off. Wings would fold up. Engines would seize from over-revving. Meanwhile, the P-47 would pull out of that same dive without a single rivet popping. Let me tell you about Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson, because his story perfectly illustrates why the P-47 earned its reputation as the most survivable fighter in the war.
June 26, 1943. Johnson was escorting bombers over France when his flight was jumped by German fighters. In the chaos of the dogfight, Johnson got separated from his wingman, the worst thing that can happen to a fighter pilot. Two experienced FW-190 pilots saw their opportunity and pounced. What happened next should have been the end of Robert Johnson's war. The two German pilots, likely veterans, raked Johnson's P-47 from nose to tail with cannon fire. They hit him over and over. Cannon shells exploded against his armor plate, blew holes in his wings, shattered his canopy, and punctured his fuselage in more than 200 places. Johnson's aircraft was so badly damaged that controls stopped responding properly. His engine was hit. His radio was destroyed. Hydraulic fluid and oil streamed from his battered plane. By all rights, he should have bailed out or died when the plane fell apart, but the P-47 kept flying. With half his instruments destroyed and his aircraft barely controllable, Johnson nursed that crippled Thunderbolt across the English Channel. He couldn't lower his landing gear. The hydraulics were shot, so he belly landed at his base in England. The ground crew counted over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes in his aircraft. Robert Johnson walked away without a scratch. The P-47 that saved his life was scrapped for parts, but Johnson went on to become one of America's top aces with 27 confirmed kills. When German pilots heard stories like this, and they did hear them, their confidence began to crack. How do you fight an airplane that simply won't die? By late 1943, the P-47 had proven itself in combat, but it still had one limitation: range. The early models could only escort bombers about 340 miles from their bases. That meant when our bombers flew deep into Germany to targets like Berlin, Munich, or the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, they had to go part of the way without fighter protection. The results were catastrophic. On October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, 60 B-17s were shot down over Schweinfurt. 600 American airmen killed or captured in a single day. The bombing campaign was on the verge of being abandoned as unsustainable, but American ingenuity provided the solution. Engineers developed external fuel tanks, drop tanks that could extend the P-47's range dramatically. These tanks hung under the wings and belly, filled with extra fuel. When empty, or when combat was imminent, the pilot could jettison them with the flip of a switch. With three 108-gallon drop tanks, a P-47 could escort bombers 600 miles from base, fight for 15 minutes over the target, and still make it home. That meant P-47s could now reach into the heart of Germany itself. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy, wait until the escorts turn back, then slaughter the unprotected bombers, no longer worked. Now, there were American fighters with them the entire way. And those fighters weren't the exhausted, fuel-starved aircraft the Germans had been facing before. They were P-47 Thunderbolts at full strength, with 850 caliber machine guns and pilots who had learned exactly how to use them. The P-47 produced more American aces than any other fighter except the P-51 Mustang. Let me introduce you to some of the men who made the Luftwaffe regret ever encountering the Jug. Francis Gabreski flew P-47s with the 56th Fighter Group and became the top American ace in Europe with 28 confirmed kills, all in Thunderbolts. Gabreski understood better than almost anyone how to exploit the P-47's advantages. He'd start at 28,000 feet, so high the German fighters below looked like specks, then dive on them at over 500 miles per hour. By the time the Germans realized they were being attacked, Gabreski's 850s had already shredded their aircraft. Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, was the tactical genius who wrote the book on P-47 combat operations. He developed the formations and tactics that maximized the Thunderbolt's strengths. Under his command, the 56th became the highest-scoring P-47 group in the 8th Air Force, with over 670 confirmed aerial victories. Robert Johnson, who we already met, finished the war with 27 kills and a reputation as one of the most aggressive pilots in the European theater. Johnson's philosophy was simple: attack, attack, attack. The P-47 could take the punishment, so use that advantage to press every attack home. These men, and hundreds of others like them, turned the P-47 from a plane the Germans laughed at into the fighter they feared most. By mid-1944, the Allies had achieved air superiority over Europe. The Luftwaffe, while still dangerous, was a shadow of its former strength. German pilots were running out of fuel, experienced pilots, and aircraft to replace their losses. The P-47 had been a major reason for that shift in the balance. But the war was far from over, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was about to prove it had another role to play, one that would make it even more feared by German forces: ground attack. Now, this might seem like a strange job for a fighter designed to fly at 40,000 feet. But think about what made the P-47 successful in air combat: massive firepower, heavy armor protection, and a rugged airframe. Those same characteristics made it perfect for attacking ground targets. The P-47 could carry an astonishing weapons load. Under its wings, it could haul 2,500 pounds of bombs. That's more than many dedicated bombers of World War I. It could carry 10 5-inch rockets, each packing enough explosive power to destroy a tank. And of course, it still had those 850 caliber machine guns loaded with armor-piercing ammunition. Most importantly, when you flew low and slow to attack ground targets, you became vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. German flak batteries and machine gun nests tore apart many Allied attack aircraft, but the P-47, with its thick armor and redundant systems, could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. As American, British, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, they looked up and saw a comforting sight: the distinctive silhouette of P-47 Thunderbolts crisscrossing the sky. Over 1,500 P-47s participated in Operation Overlord, providing air cover for the invasion fleet and close air support for troops on the ground. German commanders had prepared elaborate defenses. They had pillboxes, artillery positions, tank formations, and reinforcements ready to throw the invasion back into the sea. But they had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed they'd be able to move their forces to the battlefield without interference from the air. The P-47 proved them catastrophically wrong. Flying low over the French countryside, P-47s hunted German tanks, trucks, artillery, and troop columns. When a Thunderbolt pilot spotted a German convoy, he'd roll in, fire his rockets to scatter the formation, then make repeated passes with his 850s, shredding vehicles and equipment. Those 50 caliber rounds could penetrate the thinner armor on the sides and rear of German tanks. They could destroy trucks, staff cars, artillery pieces, and ammunition dumps. They could cut railroad lines, blow up bridges, and crater roads. And they could do it all while surviving defensive fire that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. German tank commanders learned to fear the sound of a P-47's Pratt & Whitney engine. If they heard that distinctive roar, they knew they had seconds to bail out before armor-piercing rounds started raining down on them. For 6 weeks after D-Day, Allied forces were stuck in Normandy, fighting yard by yard through the hedgerows of northern France. The Germans had turned the bocage country, small fields surrounded by thick earthen walls and dense vegetation, into a defensive nightmare. But on July 25, 1944, everything changed. Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, began with a massive aerial bombardment. P-47s played a crucial role, hitting German positions with bombs and rockets, then strafing any survivors with machine gun fire. When American tanks and infantry finally broke through the German lines, P-47s flew what were called armed reconnaissance missions. They'd patrol ahead of advancing American forces, looking for German units trying to set up defensive positions or counterattack. When they found them, and they always found them, the Thunderbolts would attack. Lieutenant Colonel Elwood Pete Quesada pioneered the concept of using P-47s as flying artillery. He developed radio communication systems that allowed ground troops to call in airstrikes directly. When American soldiers ran into a German strongpoint they couldn't reduce with their own weapons, they'd radio for P-47s. Within minutes, Thunderbolts would arrive overhead, and minutes after that, the strongpoint would cease to exist. This level of air-ground coordination was revolutionary. The Germans had nothing like it. Their own aircraft were too few and too busy trying to survive Allied fighters to provide effective ground support. Meanwhile, P-47s roamed the battlefield with near impunity, destroying everything that moved. In August 1944, Allied forces trapped a large part of the German army in France in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of vehicles were caught in a shrinking perimeter with only one road available for escape. What happened next was one of the most devastating aerial attacks in military history. P-47s, along with other Allied aircraft, subjected the trapped German forces to relentless attack. They flew mission after mission, hour after hour, day after day. German survivors later described the experience as hell on earth. They couldn't move during daylight without being attacked. Vehicles abandoned on the roads created massive traffic jams. P-47s would work over these jams methodically, destroying vehicle after vehicle. When German soldiers tried to flee on foot across the fields, Thunderbolts would make low passes, strafing with their 850s. One P-47 pilot described flying over the Falaise pocket and seeing a line of destroyed German vehicles stretching for miles. Burned-out tanks, overturned trucks, dead horses, abandoned artillery, all the detritus of a defeated army, much of it destroyed from the air. The carnage was so complete that even some Allied commanders were shocked by the devastation. But from a military standpoint, the destruction of the German forces in the Falaise pocket broke the back of the Wehrmacht in France. The road to Germany lay open. While the P-47s in Northern Europe get most of the attention, we shouldn't forget the incredible work done by Thunderbolt units fighting in Italy and the Mediterranean. The Italian campaign was a ground attacker's nightmare. Narrow mountain valleys, terrible weather, and German defenders who had turned every mountain pass and river crossing into a fortress. Allied ground forces were making slow, bloody progress up the Italian peninsula, but P-47 pilots found ways to make a difference. They specialized in attacking the German supply lines running through the mountains. Bridges, tunnels, roads carved into cliff faces. These were the lifelines that kept German forces supplied. P-47s cut them over and over. The missions were dangerous. Flying low through mountain valleys meant German gunners had plenty of opportunities to shoot at you. The weather was unpredictable, clear one moment, socked in with clouds the next. But the pilots of the 57th, 79th, and 86th fighter groups flew these missions day after day. They became experts at precision bombing. Dive bombing a bridge while flying through a narrow mountain valley, with German flak bursting around you, required tremendous skill and courage. But they did it, because cutting that bridge might mean German troops on the front lines went without food, ammunition, or reinforcements for days. There's a persistent myth that P-47s could destroy German Tiger and Panther tanks from the air with ease. The truth is more complicated and, in many ways, more impressive. A Tiger tank had frontal armor up to 100 millimeters thick. No 50 caliber round was going through that, and even rockets and bombs often couldn't penetrate it if they hit at the wrong angle. But here's what P-47 pilots figured out. You don't have to destroy a tank to take it out of action. First, even a Tiger had vulnerable spots. The engine compartment, covered by thinner armor, the tracks and suspension, the rear armor, often half as thick as the frontal armor. A skilled P-47 pilot could put rockets or armor-piercing rounds into these vulnerable areas. Second, tanks don't operate alone. They need fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, support vehicles, and infantry. P-47s could destroy all of those. A Tiger tank with no fuel, no ammunition, and no infantry support is just a 60-ton paperweight. Third, even if you couldn't destroy a tank, you could mission kill it. Damage the tracks so it couldn't move. Destroy its optics so the crew couldn't see. Force the crew to button up inside their steel box, blind and deaf, unable to fight effectively. German tank crews learned that when P-47s showed up, the best option was often to abandon their vehicles and run for cover. The psychological effect was enormous. German tankers, who should have been the masters of the battlefield, found themselves looking nervously at the sky instead of looking for enemy tanks. That fear and hesitation gave Allied ground forces a crucial advantage. By January 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. The Red Army was pushing from the east. American, British, and Canadian forces were pressing from the west. The Luftwaffe was a shell of its former self, its best pilots dead, its fuel supplies nearly exhausted, its training programs producing boys with barely enough flight time to take off and land safely. But the Germans weren't done fighting. Hitler refused to surrender, and Wehrmacht soldiers continued to resist fanatically. The war still had to be won, and the P-47 Thunderbolt still had work to do. This final phase of the war showcased everything the Thunderbolt could do. In the air, P-47s hunted the few remaining Luftwaffe fighters. On the ground, they attacked retreating German columns, destroyed railway infrastructure, and supported Allied troops as they pushed into Germany itself. The P-47 pilots of 1945 were different from the Green Rookies of 1943. These men had hundreds of hours of combat experience. They knew every trick, every tactic, every way to use the Thunderbolt's strengths. They were hunting experienced German pilots and battle-hardened Wehrmacht troops, and they were winning. December 16, 1944. The Germans launched their last major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler threw his last reserves into a desperate gamble, hoping to split the Allied armies and capture the vital supply port of Antwerp. For the first week, the Germans made good progress. Bad weather grounded Allied aircraft, and without air support, American ground forces struggled to contain the German advance. The weather was so terrible, fog, snow, and low clouds, that even trying to take off was dangerous, let alone fly combat missions. But on December 23rd, the weather broke, the skies cleared, and suddenly, hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over the battlefield. What happened next was a masterclass in air-ground cooperation. P-47s attacked German tank columns advancing through the Ardennes forests. They destroyed fuel depots, knowing the Germans were already desperately short of gasoline. They hit supply columns, ammunition dumps, and troop concentrations. The German offensive, which had been rolling forward despite fierce ground resistance, suddenly ground to a halt. Without fuel, German tanks became roadblocks. Without supplies, German troops couldn't sustain their attacks. And all the while, P-47s ranged overhead, attacking anything that moved. General George Patton's Third Army, racing north to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne, had P-47s flying ahead of them the entire way. The Thunderbolts would hit German positions, softening them up, then Patton's tanks would smash through. The Germans, caught between American ground forces and relentless air attacks, began to retreat. The Battle of the Bulge cost the Germans their last offensive capability. They lost tanks, vehicles, and trained soldiers they couldn't replace. And much of that destruction came from above, delivered by P-47 Thunderbolts. March 1945. The Rhine River, Germany's last great natural barrier, stood between Allied forces and the German heartland. The Germans had destroyed every bridge across the Rhine, or so they thought. On March 7th, American forces discovered that the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was still standing. They raced to capture it before the Germans could blow it up. For the next 10 days, that bridge became the most important piece of real estate in Europe. If the Allies could hold it and get forces across, they'd have a foothold on the eastern side of the Rhine. The Germans threw everything they had left at that bridge: artillery, demolition teams, frogmen with explosives, and aircraft, including some of the Luftwaffe's last operational jets and bombers. P-47s flew a constant combat air patrol over the bridge. Around the clock, there were always Thunderbolts overhead. When German aircraft approached, including the fearsome Me-262 jets, P-47 pilots engaged them. Despite the Me-262's speed advantage, P-47 pilots managed to shoot down several of these jets, catching them as they slowed to attack the bridge. More importantly, P-47s attacked any German force trying to approach the bridge on the ground. Artillery batteries were destroyed before they could range in on the bridge. German troops attempting to set up defensive positions on the eastern bank found themselves under constant air attack. The Ludendorff Bridge eventually collapsed from all the damage it had sustained, but by then, American engineers had built pontoon bridges across the Rhine. The gateway to Germany was open, and P-47s had helped keep it that way. We need to talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the jet in the sky. By late 1944, Germany had deployed the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. This aircraft could fly at 540 miles per hour, faster than any Allied propeller-driven fighter. On paper, the Me 262 should have swept Allied aircraft from the sky. It had four 30mm cannons, devastating speed, and could dictate when and where it wanted to fight. Several P-47 pilots encountered Me 262s and found that trying to chase them was futile. The jets simply accelerated away. But the P-47 pilots adapted, as they always did. They figured out the Me 262's weaknesses. The jets were vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when they were slow and low. They had limited endurance, 20 minutes or so of flight time before needing to land, and they were based at a limited number of airfields. P-47 pilots began loitering near known jet bases, waiting for Me 262s to take off or land. When the jets were accelerating down the runway or making their landing approach, they were slow, vulnerable targets. P-47s bounced them in these critical moments, shooting down jets before they could use their speed advantage. This tactic was dangerous. German jet bases were heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns, but it worked. P-47 pilots claimed several Me 262 kills this way, preventing the jets from becoming the game-changer Germany had hoped for. The fact that a 4-year-old propeller-driven fighter could effectively counter the most advanced aircraft technology of the war speaks volumes about the skill of American pilots and the versatility of the P-47 design. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany in April 1945, P-47 pilots flew some of the strangest missions of the war. German resistance was collapsing, but isolated units still fought on. Columns of refugees clogged the roads, making target identification difficult. The chain of command was breaking down. P-47 units found themselves flying what amounted to armed reconnaissance missions over a dying nation. They'd patrol areas ahead of advancing Allied troops, looking for any remaining German military units. When they found them, they'd attack, but always with the awareness that the war was nearly over and unnecessary risks were foolish. Some P-47 pilots flew their last combat missions in early May 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. After 3 years of combat, after thousands of missions and hundreds of thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition expended, the guns finally fell silent. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, P-47 Thunderbolts had been involved in every major campaign in Europe. They'd escorted bombers deep into Germany. They'd supported the D-Day invasion and the breakout from Normandy. They'd helped stop the Battle of the Bulge and covered the crossing of the Rhine. They'd destroyed thousands of German aircraft, tanks, vehicles, trains, and installations. While the P-47 made its reputation in Europe, we shouldn't forget the important role it played in the Pacific. The Pacific theater was challenging for the P-47. The long over-water distances favored fighters with longer range. The Japanese fighters, particularly the famous Zero, were lighter and more maneuverable. Many people assumed the P-47 would struggle in this environment. They were wrong. P-47s equipped units in the Southwest Pacific, flying from bases in New Guinea, the Philippines, and eventually Okinawa. They proved just as effective against Japanese aircraft as they had against German fighters. Japanese pilots discovered the same painful lessons their German counterparts had learned. You don't outturn a P-47, you don't outdive it, and you definitely don't survive its .850 caliber machine guns. The 348th Fighter Group, flying P-47s in the Philippines, claimed over 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed. The 318th Fighter Group, operating from Okinawa, flew combat air patrol missions and ground attack sorties during the final months of the war. In the Pacific, the P-47's ruggedness proved especially valuable. Aircraft that were damaged by enemy fire or mechanical problems faced a long flight back over open ocean. The P-47's reliability and ability to fly on one or more damaged cylinders saved many pilots' lives in this unforgiving environment. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, P-47s were among the Allied fighters that flew over the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay, a final demonstration of American air power. Republic Aviation built 15,636 P-47s between 1941 and 1945. That's more than any other fighter aircraft in American history, except the P-51 Mustang. At the peak of production, Republic's factories were turning out one P-47 every hour of every day. In aerial combat, P-47 pilots claimed 3,752 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air. That's more than any other American fighter type in Europe. When you add in aircraft destroyed on the ground, the number climbs to over 5,000. But the really impressive numbers come from ground attack missions. P-47s destroyed or damaged 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, 68,000 trucks, and countless bridges, buildings, and supply dumps. These aren't just statistics. Each destroyed locomotive meant a trainload of supplies that never reached German troops. Each destroyed truck was one less vehicle moving reinforcements to the front. The cumulative effect was to cripple German logistics, making it impossible for them to sustain their war effort. We should also acknowledge the price paid for these achievements. The P-47 had the lowest loss rate of any American fighter in Europe, only about 0.7 losses per 1,000 sorties. That's a testament to its ruggedness and survivability. But that still meant thousands of young American pilots who didn't come home. Over 3,500 P-47s were lost in combat. Each one represented a pilot, a son, a brother, a husband, a father. Men in their early 20s who volunteered to fight, climbed into their Thunderbolts, and flew into harm's way because their country needed them. Many P-47 pilots survived incredible damage to their aircraft only to be shot down on a later mission. Some became prisoners of war. Others evaded capture and made it back to Allied lines with the help of resistance fighters. Too many paid the ultimate price. When we talk about the P-47's accomplishments, we honor not just the machine, but the men who flew it. They were ordinary Americans, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, who did extraordinary things. Looking back with 80 years of hindsight, we can identify exactly why the P-47 Thunderbolt was so successful when early critics had predicted failure. First, it was designed for the right war. The engineers at Republic weren't building a 1918-style dogfighter. They were building an aircraft for high-altitude combat with heavy bombers to escort and ground targets to attack. The P-47 excelled at both missions. Second, it was survivable. In war, the best weapon isn't necessarily the one that performs the best in ideal conditions. It's the one that keeps working when everything goes wrong. The P-47 kept flying when other aircraft would have fallen apart. It brought pilots home when they should have died. That survivability meant experienced pilots survived to pass their knowledge to new pilots, creating a virtuous cycle of increasing effectiveness. Third, it had overwhelming firepower. 850 caliber machine guns with abundant ammunition meant P-47 pilots could afford to take longer shots or fire multiple bursts. They didn't have to wait for the perfect opportunity. If you could see it and you had a reasonable shot, you took it. Volume of fire compensated for the inevitable inaccuracy of air-to-air gunnery. Fourth, it was versatile. How many aircraft in history have been equally effective as a high-altitude escort fighter, a ground attack aircraft, and a bomber interceptor? The P-47 did all three roles superbly. That versatility meant commanders could deploy P-47 units wherever they were needed most. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, it was built in America by Americans. The United States industrial base in World War II was the wonder of the world. We could produce P-47s faster than Germany could replace the aircraft we shot down. We could train new pilots faster than they could train theirs. We had unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition, unlimited spare parts. Germany had none of those advantages, and that made all the difference. To truly understand the P-47's impact, we need to hear from the other side. German pilots and soldiers who faced Thunderbolts have left us their accounts, and they paint a clear picture of how the P-47 changed the war. Luftwaffe ace Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, who survived the war with 176 kills, wrote about encountering P-47s. The American Thunderbolt was an extremely unpleasant opponent. It was fast, heavily armed, and could absorb an incredible amount of punishment. We learned to respect it. German tank commander Otto Carius, who knocked out over 150 enemy tanks during the war, described the experience of being attacked by P-47s. The Jabos were our greatest fear. You could defeat enemy tanks with skill and courage. But when the Thunderbolts came, there was nothing to do but take cover and hope. They owned the sky. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, was more blunt in his assessment. The American fighter bombers made daytime movement virtually impossible. We could not bring up reinforcements, could not move supplies, could not reposition our forces. It was death by 1,000 cuts. These weren't excuses. These were battle-hardened German commanders acknowledging that American air power, with the P-47 as one of its primary instruments, had made their military situation untenable. The P-47 story didn't end in 1945. After the war, Thunderbolt served with air forces around the world. South American countries, Brazil, Chile, Peru, operated P-47s well into the 1950s. The aircraft's ruggedness and ease of maintenance made it ideal for countries with limited technical infrastructure. The French Air Force used P-47s in the First Indochina War in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Flying from bases in Vietnam, French pilots used the same ground attack tactics American pilots had perfected in Europe. The Yugoslav Air Force operated P-47s for several years after the war. The nationalist Chinese Air Force flew them during the Chinese Civil War. Even the Soviet Union, which received thousands of American aircraft through Lend-Lease, evaluated captured P-47s. The last P-47s in military service were retired by the Peruvian Air Force in 1966, 25 years after the type's first flight. Very few military aircraft have had such a long service life. Today, approximately 30 P-47 Thunderbolts still exist. Some are in museums, carefully preserved as the historic artifacts they are. Others are airworthy warbirds, maintained by dedicated enthusiasts who keep them flying so new generations can see and hear what a P-47 sounded like. If you've ever been to an air show and heard a P-47 fly overhead, you know it's an unforgettable experience. That big Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine doesn't just run, it roars. It sounds like thunder rolling across the sky, which is exactly how the Thunderbolt got its name. These flying P-47s serve as living memorials to the men who flew them in combat. When a restored P-47 makes a low pass at an air show, its 850 caliber machine gun silent now, we're connected directly to that moment in history when young Americans flew these machines into combat and won the war. Throughout this documentary, we've talked about the P-47 as a machine, its engine, its guns, its capabilities. But the real story of the P-47 is the story of the men who flew it. Men like Francis Gabreski, who went on to become an ace in Korea as well, the only American pilot to achieve ace status in 2 wars. Men like Hub Zemke, who survived being shot down over Germany, spent months as a POW, and came home to continue serving his country. Men like Robert Johnson, who that day in June 1943, when his shot-up P-47 barely made it home, could have chosen to take easier assignments. Instead, he went right back into combat, mission after mission, until the war was won. And thousands of men whose names aren't famous, who didn't become aces, who just did their jobs day after day. They flew bomber escort missions over Germany, knowing the Luftwaffe was waiting. They flew ground attack missions at low altitude, knowing every German soldier had a rifle pointed at the sky. They climbed into their Thunderbolts in England on cold, foggy mornings and flew into hostile airspace because it was their duty. These men came from every state in the Union. They were Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. They were white, black, Hispanic, and Native American. The Tuskegee Airmen's 332nd Fighter Group flew P-47s before transitioning to P-51s, proving that skill and courage have no color. They all shared one thing: they were Americans, and they were determined to win. The P-47 Thunderbolt was more than just a successful fighter aircraft. It represented something larger: the ability of American industry and American innovation to solve complex problems under pressure. In 1940, the United States Army Air Corps was barely a footnote in global air power. By 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces was the most powerful air force in the world, and the P-47 was one of the reasons why. The Thunderbolt proved that American engineers could design world-class combat aircraft. It proved that American factories could build them in quantities that overwhelmed our enemies. It proved that American pilots, given proper training and equipment, were second to none. To the men on the ground, the soldiers fighting their way across Europe, the distinctive silhouette of a P-47 meant they had support. It meant someone was watching their backs. It meant if they ran into trouble, help was just a radio call away. To German soldiers, sailors, and airmen, the P-47 represented the growing realization that they couldn't win. When you can't move during the day because American fighters control the skies, when your tanks are destroyed before they reach the battlefield, when your supply trains are shot up before they deliver their cargo, you can't sustain a war, no matter how brave your soldiers are. The P-47's success taught military planners lessons that remain relevant today. Survivability matters. An aircraft that survives to fight another day with its experienced pilot intact is worth more than a more capable aircraft that gets shot down. Modern military aircraft, the A-10 Warthog for instance, incorporate the same philosophy of heavy armor and redundant systems that made the P-47 so successful. Versatility matters. Single-role aircraft are liabilities. The ability to perform multiple missions, air superiority, ground attack, escort, means you get more value from each aircraft produced. Modern multi-role fighters like the F-15E Strike Eagle and F/A-18 Super Hornet are direct descendants of this principle. Logistics wins wars. The P-47 consumed enormous amounts of fuel and ammunition. But America could provide those resources in unlimited quantities. Germany couldn't. That industrial and logistical superiority, more than any single weapon system, determined the war's outcome. Training matters. The P-47 was a complex, high-performance aircraft. It required skilled pilots to use effectively. The United States invested heavily in pilot training, and that investment paid enormous dividends. German pilots by 1944 had minimal training, sometimes as little as 30 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat. American pilots typically had over 400 hours of training. That difference was often the difference between life and death. People often ask, was the P-47 better than the P-51 Mustang? Better than the Spitfire? Better than German fighters? The answer is, it depends on what you're asking. The P-51 had longer range and was more fuel efficient. In a dogfight, a skilled Mustang pilot might have an advantage over a P-47 pilot. But the P-47 could take far more battle damage and keep flying. It was a better ground attack aircraft. And many pilots who flew both preferred the P-47 because they felt safer in it. The British Spitfire was more maneuverable, more graceful, and beloved by its pilots. But it couldn't carry the weapons load of a P-47. It couldn't absorb the same punishment. And it didn't have the range for deep penetration escort missions. German fighters like the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109 were excellent aircraft flown by skilled pilots. But by 1943, Germany couldn't build enough of them, couldn't train enough pilots to fly them, and couldn't provide the fuel to operate them effectively. The P-47 was part of a system, American industrial might, that overwhelmed Germany's ability to respond. The best fighter isn't determined solely by specifications on paper. It's determined by how effectively it accomplishes its mission within the context of the larger war. By that measure, the P-47 Thunderbolt ranks among the most successful fighter aircraft ever built. As we come to the end of this story, I want to bring it back to where we started. The human beings who made it all happen. Think about the workers at Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York. Many of them were women who had never worked in a factory before the war. They learned to rivet aluminum skin, install hydraulic systems, and wire electrical components. They took pride in their work because they knew their quality control might save a pilot's life. Think about the ground crews in England working in cold, wet conditions to keep the P-47s flying, changing engines, patching bullet holes, reloading ammunition, refueling aircraft, often in the dark, often in the rain, always under pressure to get the planes ready for the next mission. Think about the families back home who sent their sons to war and waited anxiously for letters, who hung gold stars in their windows when those letters stopped coming, who raised the next generation with stories of fathers and brothers who flew Thunderbolts over Europe. This is the real legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt, not just a machine, but a symbol of what Americans can accomplish when we work together toward a common goal. In April 1945, a German soldier wrote in his diary, "We were told the Americans were soft, that they couldn't fight, that their equipment was inferior. We were told victory was certain. Then we saw their Thunderbolts, and we knew we had been lied to." That quote captures the essential truth about the P-47. It wasn't the aircraft German pilots expected to face. It was bigger, heavier, and less maneuverable than they anticipated. They laughed at it initially. But the P-47 didn't need to be what the Germans expected. It just needed to be effective. And it was brutally, devastatingly effective. Those 850 caliber machine guns didn't care about your tactics or your experience level. When they opened fire, they destroyed whatever they hit. That massive radial engine didn't care how many hits your cannon scored. It kept running, kept flying, kept bringing American pilots home. The P-47 Thunderbolt earned its place in history the hard way, in combat, against experienced enemies, in the most demanding conditions imaginable. It earned the respect of the pilots who flew it and the fear of the enemies who faced it. When you see a P-47 at an air show today, when you hear that big R2800 engine roar to life, take a moment to think about what it represents. Think about the 18-year-old kid from Kansas who climbed into that cockpit 75 missions in a row. Think about the factory worker who installed that engine and said a prayer that it would bring the pilot home safely. Think about the ground crew chief who nursed a shot-up Thunderbolt back to health so it could fly again the next day. The P-47 Thunderbolt won the war in the air and on the ground. But more than that, it brought Americans home. And that's the greatest victory of all. German pilots learned not to laugh at the jug. They learned to fear it, to respect it, and ultimately, to lose to it. The P-47 Thunderbolt, underestimated at first, but never underestimated twice. Thank you for joining me for this journey through history. The men who flew the P-47 Thunderbolt saved the world from tyranny. We owe them a debt we can never fully repay. The least we can do is remember their story and make sure it's never forgotten. If you found this story of the P-47 Thunderbolt and the brave men who flew it meaningful, please consider subscribing to our channel. We're dedicated to bringing you more untold stories from World War II, the battles, the technology, the heroes who made the difference. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our upcoming videos. We'll be covering more incredible aircraft, decisive battles, and the American innovation that won the war. From the Sherman tank's hidden advantages to the logistics miracles that kept our troops supplied, there's so much more history to explore together. And if you're a veteran or family member of a veteran, we'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Your experiences and memories help keep this history alive for future generations. Subscribe now, and let's make sure these stories of courage, sacrifice, and American ingenuity are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.